It's another turbulent morning in America, and the headlines are doing absolutely no one any favors. The Pentagon is now reportedly preparing 1,500 active duty troops for possible deployment to Minnesota as clashes surrounding immigration enforcement in Minneapolis refuse to cool down. Yes, you heard that right. Soldiers on standby, protests on edge, and tempers flaring faster than a faulty fuse box. This isn't a drill, and it certainly isn't a calm Tuesday. According to multiple reports, unrest linked to immigration and customs enforcement operations has entered its third consecutive week, with demonstrators repeatedly confronting federal agents outside key facilities. What began as a protest has in several instances spiraled into outright confrontation, forcing authorities to brace for escalation rather than resolution. The situation has become so volatile that the Pentagon's contingency planning now includes deploying military personnel if violence intensifies further. That alone tells you how seriously Washington is taking the chaos unfolding on the streets of Minneapolis. Minnesota's Governor Walz has already mobilized the National Guard, positioning units across the metro area to support local law enforcement if required. Translation: the state is preparing for the worst while hoping, perhaps optimistically, for the best. President Donald Trump has also weighed in, warning that he may invoke the Insurrection Act, a rarely used federal power that allows the government to deploy troops domestically to restore order. It's a legal hammer that doesn't get waved lightly, and its mention alone raises the stakes considerably. Meanwhile, activists are planning a statewide day of action, urging people to skip work, avoid school, and halt spending entirely. A full economic pause, if you will, a bold tactic, and one that's bound to test patience on every side of the divide. So where does Minneapolis stand right now? For that, let's go straight to the ground.
Another tense scene Saturday outside the federal ICE facility. Law enforcement holding the line against angry protesters who can be heard screaming, "Kill yourself," and "Un-American" to officers. The Washington Post reporting about 1,500 active duty soldiers preparing to possibly make their way here if more violence escalates. And Governor Tim Walz also mobilized the Minnesota National Guard yesterday. The Guard staged to support local law enforcement if needed and says it's ready to respond to locations across the metro area. Now, yesterday, protests continued outside the ICE detention center, and there was also a violent clash between counter-protesters at City Hall. President Trump has warned that he may use the Insurrection Act here in Minnesota, which would allow the federal government to use military troops to bring calm. Meanwhile, a statewide day of action is scheduled for this Friday. Activists are asking people not to attend work, school, or make purchases, and the St. Paul Federation of Educators is also asking people to participate in that day of action Friday. Back to you guys in New York.
All right, Matt Finn, live force in Minneapolis. Matt, thank you. It's just continuing to ramp up and up and up. And it's important as we continue to cover this story to remember how we got here. The reckless open border policies of Joe Biden led to the criminals, the violent illegal alien criminals, that ICE has gone into places like Minneapolis, a sanctuary city, to clean them up. And you had yesterday Stephen Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff, really railing on Minnesota's leaders, accusing them of aiding and abetting anti-ICE violence. Watch this.
These are acts of insurrection against the laws of the United States and against the sovereignty of the United States. Foreign illegal aliens who broke into this country, who then raped children, who committed human trafficking, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, protected, shielded, sheltered, coddled, defended at every level by the leadership in Minnesota. And then when ICE goes out to make these arrests, they unleash violent mobs to attack, assault, and impede ICE officers, and they refuse to allow the city police to protect those ICE officers in the conduct of their duties, willfully aiding and abetting this violence.
The key word there, talking about insurrection there from Stephen Miller.
Yeah, I thought they were against that.
Well, and if he's talking about insurrection, maybe we're going to get the Insurrection Act.
Yeah, oh, right.
Who knows, from President Trump. But I couldn't help but think, we're a day before honoring and celebrating the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. What was his message? Nonviolence, peaceful protests. Doesn't appear like we're seeing any of that in Minnesota.
No, not at all. It's also, there's a long history, of course, on the left of having these kind of like shock troops from, these like, activists who will create violence, create chaos, trying to destabilize the things that the administration is trying to do, things that are wildly popular. The president has a mandate. He won. The border issue, as you brought up, was front and center. Democrats recognized they were on the wrong side of it. And so now what they're saying is, we don't like the way you're doing it. And again, they find themselves on the side of, just like Kilmar Abrego, they find themselves on the side of all the people that we put up on the wall last week, showing that there were murders, rapists, as Stephen Miller said, and people who've committed terrible crimes, people that every parent would want off the streets. I think the political question here is, this is not talking about affordability from the Democrat side. Is this really what their voters want? Maybe their voters on the far left, but what about the people in the middle? And again, another thing is, Minneapolis is the home of Ilhan Omar, a deeply, deeply unpopular figure, and she has become front and center on this as well. So I think it all is not—
Throw in some fraud?
Yeah, exactly. She's suddenly like $30 million richer now, and we're uncovering all this daycare fraud. So I don't know if in the long run this is going to work. This might be their BLM.
Well, it's a great point, Rachel, because you mentioned Ilhan Omar, who is leaning hard into bringing back the abolish ICE. That has not been a winning message. And, you can dislike Stephen Miller, and you can think that his rhetoric is too harsh, but factually, he's correct. The Minneapolis is protecting these illegal criminal aliens. Now, the Mayor Jacob Frey argues that they're not a sanctuary city. They have a separation ordinance. But at the end of the day, they do the same thing. They refuse to cooperate with ICE. The White House called him out yesterday, saying Minnesota sanctuary politicians have released nearly 470 criminal illegal aliens back into American communities since President Trump took office. ICE working every single day to remove the worst of the worst criminal illegal aliens from terrorizing their state. I would just add to that, Rachel, there's also 1,360 violent illegal criminal aliens currently in custody in Minnesota jails held by authorities. And yet all ICE is saying is, just hand them peacefully to us. Don't release them to the streets. It keeps the community safer, and we don't have ICE having to make arrests at large.
We know a lot of these protesters are paid, but among these protesters are a lot of rich Edina moms pining for their 1960s protests in their university days. Those ladies are protected from a lot of this. Their kids are not getting crowded out in schools by illegal aliens because they're in private schools, and they're living in neighborhoods that are, protected or gated. So they are among the paid protesters, but I do not think that they represent the common sense people. The problem in Minnesota is common sense people are cowed into silence. They're so afraid. I mean, you saw that with the crime being committed in the daycares. Lots of good people saw the corruption, but were so afraid in that political environment in Minneapolis of being called racist for calling out the corruption.
Yeah, and we'll see as we continue to cover this whether or not the really frigid temperatures will dial things down. There's calls for more protests today and coming this week.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.
We're now entering week 3 of sustained unrest here in Minnesota, and despite repeated appeals for calm, the clashes between protesters and law enforcement show no sign of slowing down. If anything, tensions appear sharper, louder, and more unpredictable by the day. Saturday night brought yet another charged confrontation outside the federal ICE facility. Law enforcement officers formed a defensive line as protesters hurled verbal abuse, with some chants crossing well beyond political dissent and into outright hostility. It was raw, volatile, and deeply uncomfortable to witness. According to the Washington Post, roughly 1,500 active duty soldiers are now preparing for possible deployment should conditions deteriorate deteriorate further. At this stage, no formal orders have been issued, but the readiness alone signals how close this situation is to breaching a critical threshold. Governor Walz confirmed that the Minnesota National Guard has been strategically staged across the region, ready to respond at short notice. Their role, officials say, is to support local law enforcement, protect infrastructure, and prevent further escalation. Whether that presence reassures or inflames remains a matter of perspective. Protests continued outside the ICE detention centre throughout the weekend, while a separate clash between protesters and counter-protesters erupted near City Hall. Police were forced to intervene, underscoring how quickly these gatherings can fracture into chaos when opposing sides collide. The political temperature continues to rise. President Trump's warning about potentially using the Insurrection Act has sparked fierce debate, with supporters calling it necessary enforcement, while critics warn of a dangerous precedent. Either way, the federal government is not ruling out its most extreme options. Adding another layer to the pressure, organisers have announced a statewide day of action this Friday, encouraging mass absenteeism from work and school, alongside a consumer boycott. Even the St. Paul Federation of Educators has urged participation, signalling how deeply this unrest has penetrated civil institutions. As it stands, Minneapolis remains tense, divided, and braced for what comes next. Law enforcement is holding the line, protesters are holding their ground, and the rest of the country is watching, waiting, and wondering which way this all tips. Back to you. This story is still developing, and the implications stretch far beyond Minnesota. When domestic protest meets military preparedness, history tells us one thing: the outcome is rarely simple. If you want clear, sharp, no-nonsense coverage that cuts through the noise, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Is this necessary security or a step too far? We're reading everything. Stay informed, stay sharp. We'll see you next time.